Okay, let's take a test. What do you remember from last night?
I didn't want to give you anything.
Do what?
I didn't want to give
You didn't want to give me anything. Well, we're not gonna do that tonight. I don't want to end on a bad note. What determines the intensity of an emotion? Remember?
How strong you feel it.
Okay. How strong we feel about it, how dear it is to us. Okay? How does our body or how does our mind process and create emotions? Remember that one? What comparison does our mind do to create an emotion? Okay, perception versus who we think we are and what's accumulated as far as our experiences in life. Okay? So those are two keys that as we look at emotions, those are two keys to always keep in mind. Okay? My emotions are based on what I believe about myself, conscious or unconscious, or what my experience have created in me, as it compares to what I perceive another person to do to me. Okay? And if those two line up and they give a positive experience, then we have comfortable emotions. We have joy and happiness. But if they don't line up and we perceive something about ourselves and someone says something about us that don't really line up, then it produces those uncomfortable emotions. And that intensity becomes how dear that is to me in that process. Okay? So, do you know anybody, and don't point fingers, do you know anybody who has struggled with a relationship a good part of their lives and they just can't get over it? Somebody hurt them years ago and they can't get over it? Someone did something or said something to them, and every time they're in their presence, they just get those negative emotions, or those I'm not calling positive or negative because they're really amoral. They're not good or bad, but those emotions come back all the time. I go on travel all over the country and listen to different churches, and it doesn't take long for someone to say something about, so-and-so back 20 years ago said something and it really hurt the church. And there's still those bothersome events that we still haven't figured out how to get over. And so right now, before we take our break, we're going to talk about this idea of how do we break through from those emotions that are constantly being a part of who we are. Okay? Because one of the things that we find as we look into emotions and we do some investigation about emotions, certain emotional responses can become part of our identity. Think about a father who is pretty, we'll say, angry. And the way he feels that he can get his children to obey him is to constantly raise his voice. Constantly show that aggression, but not in a bad way, but he makes it to where he imposes himself upon them because that's the way he relates. And he realizes the only way he can get anything done is to raise his voice and to scream and yell. Now, eventually, his brain and his mind will make that part of his identity. And he will become to realize that he can't get anything done unless he's yelling. The same goes with someone who has a conflict with somebody else, and they deal with it over and over again for years and years and years, and then they can't even relate to other people without having that emotion or having that response to emotions being part of who they are in their life. And so they react. But how do we break through with that? How do we learn to break through some of that? Because I don't believe that God has caused or calls us to live with those hurts and those challenges and those difficulties. He calls us to be free, and he calls us to live a life that allows us to be free from those negative things or those difficult things in our lives. But so what we see is we kind of go through life, and I think Wes, where'd you go? That one's not working. Did I need to turn it off and turn it back on? You sure? There. Oh, no. Let's try again. There it is. So sometimes we get into these patterns of life. And we get into these struggles of life when we deal with our relationships with people, and we get to where we start thinking these things about each other. Things like, I wish they were different. I wish that person was just a little bit different. Okay? I wish that they acted a little bit different in the way they do that, and then I wouldn't feel so bad. Or it's, if they would just do what I need them to do, then I would be okay. If they would change their behavior, then I will be okay. Or, I'm just mad because they never pay attention to me like they should. So then we begin to talk these things through, and we begin to say things like, it's not fair. It's not fair that they get to do this and I don't. You ever heard kids say that? It's not fair that my friends get to have a cell phone at 8 years old and my kids didn't get it till they were 15. Okay? But in that process, sometimes we're like, it's not fair. As we get through going through these processes, these are processes that our brain begins to go through. And if you think about someone else who's mistreated you or done something wrong, if you continually go through those cycles, what happens to that emotion? We continue to go through those cycles of it's just not fair. What happens to that emotion? It intensifies. Because you're processing it over and over again, expecting a different result, but all you're doing is dwelling on that issue. Okay? So we talked some about that last night. So what we see and what we're going to look at now is some of those emotions that our challenge becomes, how do we listen to them? Or how do we ignore them? Or do we just carry them around with us all our life? Okay? There are pains and hurts that I've had in my life that for years I carried them. You know, there are things that I did in my life that produced certain actions in me that I carried that were from something someone said when I was in high school. And they challenged me to grow in that process. So here's some of those emotions, and we'll kind of go through them, and I think they're going to just show up as they go through. The bondage of uncomfortable emotions, and these are just a few of those emotions. The emotion of resentment and bitterness. Okay? Resentment is basically an emotion that comes from unresolved anger, or comes from an unresolved issue that's created in us a relationship because someone else wronged me. Okay? Now, let me ask you this. Is it wrong to be hurt or resentful? Not necessarily. Okay? But what we do with that resentment does make an issue for those around. And one of the challenges is resentment is not a primary emotion. Okay? Hurt or anger are the primary emotions, but resentment comes as we continually dwell on that problem. Right? So as we continually dwell in this unresolved anger and this unresolved issue in our lives, we dwell on it and we dwell on it and dwell on it until we get to the point where we just don't like that person. Or we just don't like that family. Or we just don't like that child. Okay? Because that anger has been building and that resentment or that hurt has been continually building till it gets to a point that it is part of our identity. And it creates a bitterness in us, and it creates an action of when we think of somebody else, there's just that bitterness and that anger there. So we see that resentment and anger is not a short-term emotion like we talked about last night, but it's a constant that begins to be part of our life, just like bitterness. The second one is there's an emotion that's a bondage emotion that psychologists call this idea of comparison. Okay? And we do this emotion basically because we get to this point where we look at others and we compare others to what's going on in our life. Okay? if I compare my life with someone else's, and I am on the short end of that stick, okay, it's going to produce things like discouragement, jealousy, and poor self-image. So as I look at your life, if I'm on the short end and I'm not being the one who's important, then I feel discouraged. I feel like I'm less of a person, or I begin to be jealous of what you have, which is negative emotion. But the emotion comes as we compare ourselves to other people. But if we compare ourselves to someone else and we come out on the better side of that, often it produces arrogance. It produces a smugness. If you think about the Pharisees in Jesus' time, how did they see themselves in comparison to the rest of the people? They were the teachers of the law. They looked down upon others. Well, they had gone through a continual process of comparing themselves to others. If you look at the tax collector, the tax collector and the Pharisee in the prayer, well, praise God, Lord, I'm not like those guys, because that comparison is constantly there in their lives. And so we see that comparison issue creates a series of emotions. Okay? If I compare to someone else's job and mine doesn't look so good, then I may get jealous. I may get worried, or and so they produce different emotions in that process. But if mine is better, you just worked as hard as I did, you'd be all right. Okay? So we see that's another emotion. Then we have another emotion of depression. And what's interesting is depression is actually sadness. Okay? We didn't get to that one last night, but sadness is the loss of something. If I lose something, I become sad because the comparison that your brain is doing is I had something and no longer I have it. And that can go anywhere from your car keys all the way up to a loved one, or even to an ideal, or even to a belief. And so there's so many things that sadness comes from. But what challenges us in sadness is one of those emotions that easily loops upon itself. The more you think about the loss, the more sad you become. The more sad you become, the more you think about your loss, which makes you more sad. Okay? So in the process, it's a natural process, but in that process, we see that sadness becomes to go through that process over and over and over again. The challenge is that after we've gone through the sadness issue, if it's become chronic in our lives, it leads to depression. Okay? You don't start out one day and all of a sudden, poof, you're depressed. It comes from that loss that goes through that cycle over and over and over again. And that's where it becomes into depression. Okay? It's very hard to deal with. And that's why when people get depressed, depression is that emotional of sadness, but that's why it's so hard to deal with, because the more they think about the issue, the more depressed they become. And it challenges, and that's one of those emotions that begins to be very challenging for us. Disappointment, and I'm going through these emotions, but then I'm going to give us some practical tools on how do we handle some of these. Disappointment. You ever expected someone to do something and they didn't get it done for you? I was disappointed. Have you ever wanted to be recognized at work and they didn't quite recognize you like you thought? You ever wanted to, even the simplest, you wanted to be on time for church and your car broke down and you didn't make it on time because you wanted to prove to everybody you could be on time? The process of disappointment is when your dreams or what you're wanting to happen doesn't take place. Okay? If you expected certain things from your spouse or expected certain things from your children and they don't fulfill your expectations, you become disappointed. Okay? It's a natural response of having expectations that don't get met. Okay? And it's something that if we constantly are looking at the expectations and they're not being met, we're going to get into this cycle of disappointment. Okay? Now, one of our challenges is our expectations for people are way up here, and they're only capable of functioning here. Okay? So our disappointment is a challenge of what are those expectations and what they are. Okay? So we see that another emotion that in our life can become that burden on us is disappointment. Chronic illness. Okay? Chronic illness becomes an emotion that burdens us because it produces things like weakness. It produces things like constant struggles, pain. And so those emotions that come along with weakness are a challenge to us because in that state, not only the person suffering that, but those who are caring for those people they have those emotions. So caring for someone who's chronically ill produces emotions in the person who's doing the caring just as much as it's producing the emotions in the person who's suffering the illness. Okay? My father-in-law is in stage 3 of congestive heart failure. He does not want to burden anyone. And he likes to be active and he likes to get up. And so when he can't get out of bed, he gets sad because he's losing his ability. Okay? But also, my daughter has to constantly take care of him, so it becomes a stress and a strain on her. And my daughter, my wife. Okay? My daughter takes care of him too, but okay? Think about a person who has a chronic illness that they no longer can drive. What kind of pressure does that put upon them in that process? So we see that these emotions and these illnesses can create anxiety, and they can create tension, and they can create struggles in that process that we have to figure out, just like we do anger, how do we deal with that? Okay? And we can't just say that it doesn't exist. And the last one's grief. The emotion of grief, that in that process, it becomes this struggle with what's truly going on and what loss you're facing. Okay? And not having the things the way they were. Not having the people around you who were there. Okay? So people, things, ideas, jobs, relationships that are no longer available to you, that used to be available to you, or the loss of those things creates a great tension in your life. Okay? And those things can be like divorce, loss of health, loss of job, married, retirement. So those things that you lose, that if we constantly dwell on what we lost, it's going to produce that same cycle as sadness and not having what you need. So these emotions become the ones that drag us down. Can you relate to any of those emotions? Right? If you've ever dealt with life, you've dealt with some of these emotions. Now, what's interesting is our society, these emotions are prevalent and constant in our society as we go through them. Okay? Any questions, any comments before I give you some steps? Yes?
I was going to say that oftentimes how we feel or think about individuals, if we get to know them enough to know that they're going through some of these things, then we're a little more, we just understand. And when you're more understanding, besides praying,
Yeah.
we understand that. If I knew that I laid on to
Mm-hmm.
that,
Yeah.
that's why I think we just get to know each other.
Yeah, we do. I mean, knowing someone else's struggles gives you the freedom to change your perception of what's going on in their lives. I mean, if somebody's really struggling with their faith and you didn't know that they were having this chronic pain of illness, you would just think, well, they're just not doing what they're supposed to. But if you understand that struggle, maybe you have a different compassion towards them in that process. Yes, sir.
You spoke concerning sadness building on itself.
Mm-hmm.
Does joy do the same thing?
Absolutely. And we will get out, because one of the things that we see as a solution to this cycle that we run into is joy and gratitude. And we'll look at that. But yes, the more you look for joy, the greater joy you have. Okay? The more you consider it all rejoicing, what happens? The more rejoicing you can do. Okay? So yes, it does build on itself as well. Good point. Okay? So we're just talking about those negative ones. Now here's the interesting thing. What can you do to help someone get out of their emotional state? What can we do as people to make sure that our friends or our spouse or our loved ones change the way they're feeling? Okay, there is that portion that we can associate, we can encourage them. Empathy, understanding, okay? But in reality, we can't change their emotional state. When I'm frustrated, when I'm angry, or when I'm sad, or when I'm struggling with depression, who can help me change that? Or who has to be changed that? Why are you pointing at me? Because that's true. I can't make you do anything just like you can't make me do anything. Now, there is that understanding, there's that compassion, there's walking with them. But they have to do the work. We have to do the work in that process. You know, we talked about that image that if they would understand, if they were fair, when we're in these emotional states, sometimes we try to push our emotions off on someone else, and if they'll change, then I'd be all right. Well, that doesn't work because our emotions are up here and what we're wrestling with, okay? Now, in these cycles, I will tell you that in these cycles, if they can get so severe that there maybe needs a mental health professional to help through that process, okay? They may get so imbalanced and they may need a medical doctor to get them on a hormonal equilibrium so that they can do that. But for the most part, in this process, this is something that we deal with on a day-to-day basis and on a weekly basis. And if the one who's struggling with these emotions, is the one who has to challenge ourselves to grow out of them, not expect others to make the change for us, okay? So here's some key freedoms. Here's how we learn to overcome in our lives these struggles with these cycle of emotions that are constantly dragging us down. The first one becomes we have to learn to have the attitude of surrender, okay? When I'm talking about the attitude of surrender, this is what I'm talking about. Whatever you do, work heartily as though it was for the Lord, knowing that for the Lord you will receive an inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back the wrong that he has done, and there is no partiality. That's Colossians. What's Paul saying to the brethren? What's he saying to them in that process? He's saying you work for God, not for the response you expect out of someone else. Okay? So if I'm struggling with disappointment, the solution to that is my disappointment is for me to act the way I'm supposed to act and surrender myself to God, and God is the one who is there to determine whether I'm successful or not. So if I'm disappointed in someone else, what do I do with that? I submit it to God. If I'm struggling with grief and depression, what do I do with that? I surrender it to God and let God handle all of that other stuff. Because disappointment and grief and comparison is all about me comparing myself to other people and about what's going on in their lives. So as we struggle with that, how do we do that? We learn to turn ourselves over and submit to God. And if we let God do the work, He'll take care of it. Okay? That constant resentment. If I'm resentful towards someone, what am I expecting? To pay them back for what they did to me. Well, submission is I turn that over to God and let Him repay and not myself. Okay? The second one, C, is we have to learn to be people who search for truth. Truth in all aspects. So if we have an attitude of truth, when we look at what went on or what's going on that's creating these uncomfortable emotions in us constantly, we have to learn to decide and look, what is the truth in that? What is my part in that? What is their part in that? How could I be different? How could I change what I did? Because when we're focused on them, we get no change in our emotional state. But when we learn to evaluate ourselves, look at my part in that, it begins to alleviate that process in us. And so John chapter 8, 31 through 32 is, if you abide in my word, he's talking about the word of God. He's talking about what's going on. He says, you are truly my disciples. And the more you learn about truth, and he's talking about the word of God, but the more we learn about the truth of our situation and who we are and what's going on in our lives, the more free we become to let go of those emotional stressors, those emotions in our lives, right? If I am resentful towards someone and I am in this state of resentfulness towards someone, the best way to get out of that is to understand that I am also a sinner and a struggling. Because what I'm trying to do to that other person is to hold them to a standard. Well, God didn't hold me to that standard, right? So we learn to go through that process. The third one, the attitude of a follower. And I really like this one because one of our challenges when we begin to talk about emotions and begin to talk about difficulties, emotions, is that we get to in this comparison process. Okay? Now, if you think about in the story at the end of John's book in John chapter 21, we know that Peter has denied Jesus. Okay? He denied him 3 times, and then in that process, he's seen Jesus after his resurrection. But in that process, there was probably still some tension there between Peter and Jesus and Peter and the other disciples. Okay? At the end of the book, he goes and Jesus goes and he calls them because they've gone back to fishing and they've gone back to doing what they naturally knew how to do. And he goes up and he gets them. They come into shore. He has breakfast with them, and then he goes for a walk with Peter. Okay, and that's where he talks about Peter, feed my sheep. If you love me, feed my sheep. And he does that multiple times. But there's a really interesting interaction in verse 22. Peter and Jesus are having this conversation. And Peter turns and kind of looks at John. If you look at the text, he kind of responds to Jesus, well, Jesus, what about him? Okay? So he's comparing himself to John. And Jesus says, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is it to you? You follow me. So one of our challenges in dealing with our emotional state is we get in this comparison process. And I believe Jesus says, don't worry about this other person. You follow me. You do what you need to do and let me worry about them. Same as we talked about is that surrender. Don't worry about them, okay? If that resentment's coming because someone hurt you dearly and you haven't been able to get through it, the way to get through it is you just follow Jesus and let Jesus take care of that, okay? And that's what he's saying to Peter. A little bit, the context is a little bit different, but he's trying to get Peter to understand that what he wants from Peter is Peter to follow him. So when we go through that process of dealing with our emotions, it's about me becoming a follower of Jesus. If Jesus says forgive, well, but they haven't asked for forgiveness. No, it's not about them. It's about you, okay? And so we get into that attitude of being a follower. The fourth attitude that we can help us with breaking through from these emotions is this idea of imitating God. You know, if I'm struggling with forgiving someone, or I'm struggling with anger towards someone, or because they hurt me, or I've lost something, well, what did God do in that situation? What did Jesus do in that situation? What did the apostles do in that situation? And I think part of that understanding is learn to be merciful like your Father is merciful, is what Jesus is saying. When they're talking about that comparison and that tension that Jesus saw in his society between Pharisees and sinners and disciples and other disciples, is don't be like them, be like the Father. And God is merciful. God is forgiving. God lets go of things that he needs to let go of, right? He doesn't keep bringing them up. So be like God. Be like Jesus. You know, Jesus could have held a grudge against Peter if he had thought about it. Because just a few moments earlier, Peter was saying, I'll go to my grave for you. He betrays it, or he doesn't acknowledge him. But we don't see Jesus holding that grudge on Peter. So be like Jesus. So the standard of how you react and how you deal with your emotions is not like your spouse. It's like Jesus and how he deals with his emotions in that process. The fifth attitude, and this is where joy comes into play, the fifth attitude is about thanksgiving. Paul says, I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. In every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger and abundance and need. What's the solution to all of that loss and all that hurt and all that anger and all that challenge that Paul had faced? Because if you look at his life, he had every reason to be angry. And he had every reason to be sad. And he had every reason to be depressed. But what was Paul's solution to those emotions? I've learned to be content. Exactly. Because when we're focused on what we don't have, we get into that battle of depression or loss or comparison. So Paul says, don't worry about all that stuff. The key to all of that is whether you've got a lot, whether you don't have any, whether you're okay or you're not, or whether you're hungry or you've got abundance. He says the solution to that is to learn to be content in where you find yourself. So an attitude of contentment, an attitude of thanksgiving. Consider it all joy when you undergo trials and tribulations. Okay? So contentment and thanksgiving. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Right? That's where that process of helping us overcome those deep-seated emotions and those challenging emotions come into play. And when Thanksgiving starts, I think another way we learn to overcome our own personal emotions is that we learn to serve others. If you're struggling with an emotion towards someone in the sense of being resentful or bitter towards someone, there is no better way to get out of that than to serve them. If someone hurts you, the best way to handle those emotions of that hurt is to serve them. Be grateful to God and turn around and serve them in that process. Right? So consider the hurt as an opportunity to serve them and to please God in what you do. Learn to be generous. Do we truly believe that it's more blessed to give than to receive? Yeah, but they should do what I need them to do for me. Okay? So as we go through that, that's talking about giving gifts and whatnot, but think about it. Give the gift of forgiveness. Give the gift of hope. Give the gift of thanksgiving instead of just expecting them to do that for you. So we see that as an attitude of generosity. When we go through that process, that's who we become in that process. So there's the gift. Attitude of perspective. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. That is not, that should be John 9, sorry. John 9, when the apostles come up and there's a blind man, they ask Jesus, now who sinned? This man or his parents that he was born blind? Well, Jesus says neither one of those, okay? So when we look at perspective, when we look at certain things about people's lives, sometimes changing our perspective about who they are determines how we treat them or how we feel about them. Just like you were saying, once you learn how people are, you change your perspective about them, it changes how you feel about them. That's where we need to come in the process of dealing with our own emotions of anger and bitterness and resentfulness, comparison, is that we need to try to view people in a perspective that is a godly perspective in that. Right? And so as we go through that process, we learn to change our perspective. Right? And that can happen in changing what we think about people. The attitude of compassion. The attitude of showing compassion upon people. And Jesus showed compassion to them all the time. When they hurt Jesus, or when they were mean to Jesus, or when they wanted to stone Jesus, or when they just came to Jesus because they wanted the food that he provided, it says over and over and over again in the text, he saw them and he was compassionate towards them. If you have someone who's hurt you, if you have someone who creates this uncomfortable emotion in you, compassion towards them helps in that process. And finally, the last one is we have to learn to have an attitude of forgiveness. Not an attitude of grudging, or not an attitude of holding on, but learning to have an attitude that forgives. Because you think about Jesus when he's going to the cross, and they've beat him, they've slandered him, they spit in his face, they've challenged him, they said he's not worth anything, they've said that he's really not who he says to be, and in that process, what is the statement that Jesus says towards them, to God? He says, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You know, one way to get over hurt is to forgive them because they know not what they do. Because the more you dwell on the hurt and give them and think about how they did that intentionally towards you, all it does is feed that cycle. But if you can let go of that cycle by forgiving them, even though they don't know what they do, then it comes about the place where you can receive that forgiveness. So how do we handle these deep emotions that are just this wheel that we go on often? How do we deal with the disappointment over our children? How do we deal with the disappointment over men? How do we deal with the disappointment and the anger and the hostility towards those who wronged us? No. Attitude is everything. Change your attitude. Change your perspective. Change your attitude. Change your direction. Change your submission. And God will get you to where you need to be able to let go of those emotions in that process. Any questions? Any comments? Yes?
Well, I couldn't help with that. It just seems like, too, that God knows how we are.
Mm-hmm.
But he also tells us in his word that he allows the weaknesses to be a part of our life, because those are the times when we feel sorry for ourselves, all that is true. But then that's when we're vulnerable, that's when we're apt to open that Christ can do for us, or that our Christians can do.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Just say, I want to have this, and then you'll word
That's a change in perspective. Change in perspective. Great point. Anything else before we take a break? Going once. Going twice. Forever hold your peace. No, just kidding. Let's take a break. Let's go have some cake or some pie and ice cream, and we'll be back in here. And what time do we need to be back in here? 7:15. Be back at 7:15. Ready to start at 7:15.